Oregon will have a new Secretary of State in January, Tobias Read, who is currently Oregon State Treasurer. So what are Read's priorities as he takes over from Secretary of State Lavonne Griffin-Valade, and how does he see the Secretary of State's role moving forward? The Willamette University graduate with a master's in business from the University of Washington, Read also worked for Nike, served in the Oregon legislature, and was a candidate for governor in 2022, losing out in the Democratic primary to now Governor Tina Kotek. Tobias Read, congratulations and welcome back to Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thanks, Ken. Good to be with you.
What do you see as the biggest change in the transition going from Treasurer to Secretary of State?
Well, I think it's just going to be a different set of specific responsibilities. But one thing that really gratifies me is that I think there's a lot of similarities. The fact that this is an elected statewide office that, that supervises a staff of around 200 and is really a regulator and administrator with a portfolio of responsibilities that really matter to Oregonians. In the case of the Secretary of State's office, of course, we're talking about elections and making sure that people have trust in our systems, and the audit responsibilities that help us narrow the gap between our good intentions in Oregon and our execution that sometimes doesn't always measure up. So execution and making sure that we're making good on those promises is really exciting to me.
All right, let's talk about elections and then audits. The Secretary of State oversees elections. Election integrity was a big issue this time around. In Oregon, we did see non-citizens who were signed onto the voter rolls by DMV. Do you advocate changes in Oregon's motor voter law, and how did you view that situation?
What an interesting way of putting that question. So let's be clear, first off, all the data that we've seen so far is clear that there were never enough errors to impact the outcomes of an election. But as someone who really believes that we are stronger when people who are eligible to vote and participating, I am just appalled at how that situation was handled. The Secretary of State's office is responsible for ensuring the integrity of voter rolls, and that's a responsibility I take really seriously. I'm glad that there is a review underway. I'm looking forward to seeing that review, and if it's not satisfactory, it doesn't meet my expectations, I'll initiate my own review, because that is among the most fundamental responsibilities of the Secretary of State's office.
Do you advocate any changes from what you've seen of the situation so far?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm encouraged by what the DMV has described as the changes they're making in their processes, but we have to make sure that the policies line up with the intentions and that the execution is consistent with that intention. If that's not being followed through on, then we have to continue to hold people at the DMV and the Secretary of State's office accountable.
Let's stick with elections. Voter turnout in Oregon estimated around 71% this time around. That's about 10 points below where we were during the last presidential election. The results aren't certified until December 2nd, but at this point, what does this voter turnout in Oregon tell you?
Well, I think all people who are running for office and who have the privilege of serving in elected office have to take that responsibility seriously and not feel like anyone's entitled to anything. Voters have a choice. We've made it convenient in Oregon to vote, just about as convenient as it can be, but people still have to choose to vote. And I think all candidates have a responsibility of trying to respond to the needs and the desires that voters are expressing. And to the extent we're not having 100%, and that's a missed opportunity, we've got to make sure that we're connecting with the very real issues that voters are feeling and struggling with.
The Secretary of State also in charge of audits, as you mentioned. Can you identify any areas of state government that you would look at closely in terms of audits?
Yes, I want to make sure that our audits and our audit plan are driven not by anecdotes or an agenda of weaponization, but by a realistic assessment of risk. And we're going to have to make some choices and some priorities, because there's a lot more appetite for audits than there is capacity. For me, there are three criteria. One is, where are we spending a lot of money and not getting the results that we want? Housing might be an example of that. A second criteria is, where do we have a history of underperformance with respect to our spending? IT might be an example of that. And the third one is, where does the state take a direct responsibility for the well-being of individual Oregonians? That might be foster care. So these are just examples, but I think where are we going to get the most audit bang for audit buck is the place to start. And making sure that those findings are in front of decision makers, whether they are legislators or local governments or school boards, so that we can make decisions based on the audit results.
One of the reasons that this position was open was the resignation of former Secretary of State Shemia Fagan over her financial ties to the LaMotta cannabis company. Lavonne Griffin-Valade, who's doing the job now, stated that she would not run for re-election. How did what happened with Fagan factor into your desire to run for Secretary of State? And give me your overall view of that whole Lamoda situation.
Well, I just think I know that my job is really clear, and I've had a great experience as treasurer. I've been busy enough as treasurer that I've never even thought about doing anything else, and that will be the same as Secretary of State. I'm confident there is enough work there to keep me more than busy, and that's going to be my priority, to bring stability and professionalism to an office that I think really needs it. In the time that I've been treasurer, for example, there have been 4 different secretaries of state, not even counting the acting folks who have filled in on a short-term basis. So I think having someone who is committed to that job and committed to restoring that the resources and the stability there is really going to make a difference. That is absolutely my priority.
You have mentioned during your campaign restoring trust. What does that mean? What does it mean to restore trust in the Secretary of State's office?
I think it means being really clear about our expectations, about our approach to things, about revealing where we're going to take things on. One example of that that's really clear, the Secretary of State will now have the responsibility of implementing campaign finance reform that the legislature passed in the last session. That is going to be really complicated and challenging. And in order to do that, we're going to need to be clear about how candidates, voters, parties, industries are all going to implement and interact with the new system, and it's going to take an aggressive outreach effort to make sure that people understand that. So being really open and transparent about that, I think, is one example of how we restore trust in the office.
You handily defeated your Republican challenger, former state senator Dennis Linthicum. All executive positions in the state now, including yours, filled by Democrats, as is control of the legislature. So how does that play into your view of this role, the fact that your party basically controls the executive branch?
It does not play into my conception of the role. I think the job of the Secretary of State is to enforce the rules consistently, without fear or favor, regardless of who is involved. That's been consistent for me as state treasurer, too. I've had, in a number of cases, to take positions that are not popular with my own party because of the obligation I have as state treasurer. And I expect that will be true as Secretary of State as well. And that does not bother me, because I'm going to be a Secretary of State for all Oregonians. I want to make sure that people have trust in our electoral systems, that they choose to vote, knowing that their vote counts, even if it results in an outcome they don't like. We want processes that are earning the trust and confidence of Oregonians, and that's a very sacred responsibility I take seriously.
You've also emphasized the environment when you were running. How do you see your role as Secretary of State when it comes to things like climate change and the balance between urban and rural here in the state of Oregon?
Mm-hmm. So the Secretary of State, along with the Governor and the Treasurer, is a member of the State Land Board with the responsibility of managing trust lands for greatest permanent value. What that means is looking out for the future. And I'm really proud of the work we've done in the Land Board, in particular around the Elliott State Forest, now the largest research forest in North America. And that approach to really ask some new questions and create space for new answers, I think, is emblematic of how we'll take that on. The Secretary of State is also the chair of the State Sustainability Board, and I'm looking forward to bringing the lessons that I've learned as treasurer, investing for the long run, to this office and the Secretary of State's office.
Secretary of State-elect Tobias Read, thank you very much. Appreciate you being here on Eye on Northwest Politics.
My pleasure. Thank you.